Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of our TM Soup to Nuts video series. In today's episode, we will be looking at the handshake that needs to happen between sales and transportation for your outbound sales planning process to work correctly. There are two questions that we need to address as part of this process to set up ourselves for success. The first question is, how do we tell the system that a particular sales order is going to be requiring TM planning to be integrated into it? Because indeed, you may not necessarily want all of your sales orders to be planned via transportation management. So that's the first thing, and we will look at the self-service configuration UI that is available to make that setting in the system. The second, which has a very strong business impact, I would say, is the freight unit building rule. And the freight unit building rule really is the glue that ties sales to transportation. The freight unit building rules include a certain number of settings and parameters that tell the system how it should translate those sales order requirements into a transportation requirement. In addition to that, TM out of the box does not work with the technical object that the sales order is. So we need to also translate that technical object of sales order into another object that TM will understand. And that object is the freight unit. So again, the freight unit building rule is there to make sure that once all of the settings and parameters of the freight unit building rule have been applied to the sales order, the output of that is going to be one or more freight units that will then be used in transportation management to carry out the planning. As we will see in a subsequent episode, when we deal and look at the planning part of the process, we will see that what we have to do is to plan freight units, in other words, assign them to a particular freight order where the execution will then happen. So let's take an example that we can work through to kind of bring to bear all of these concepts that we've just talked about. And then to taper off this recording, we'll actually jump into the system and see how changes made to a sales order and to the freight unit building rule will affect the production of those freight units that TM will then use in the planning. To illustrate things, let's look at this sales order that we have before us. As usual, a sales order is created within a particular organizational level, a sales area. It uses also structural information such as a particular document type, and in this case also a shipping condition, which, as we'll see, is primarily important for the integration to transportation management. We can also see that the sales order is made up of multiple items with different units of measure, being pieces, kilos, liters. We have different products, widgets, things, stuff. We also have different requested delivery dates, and we also have different requested shipping addresses. In this case, we've left it at a high level, being Texas and California. So there is a mix of products, units of measure, dates, and destinations on this sales order. Now, before we delve really into the details of this, there are also, I think, 3 basic and fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself to make this process work correctly. Number 1 is, do you have good quality data? As we can see here, we have units of measure such as pieces and liters, but such units of measure are somewhat meaningless when we look at transportation, because a transportation resource will usually be measured in terms of a maximum weight or maximum volume that it can transport. If you ask a particular carrier to transport 10 units of a widget, it's going to be meaningless for them to provide a positive response to a request. What they will need to understand is what is the maximum weight, what is the maximum volume of what you're trying to transport. So that means that your master data should also be clean, complete, meaning that you cannot just say the unit of measure is piece. You also have to indicate meaningful quality information such as the weight, such as the volume, and then if a particular piece can be packaged in other units of measure such as boxes and pallets, then that information also needs to be recorded into your system. Failure to do so will only lead to issues when you look at the transportation process. The second item that we're going to be looking at is, are all sales orders TM relevant? As I said earlier on, it could be that some sales orders you do not wish to have planned with transportation management. So to determine if a particular sales order should be planned via TM or not, there is a simple SSCUI called Define Transportation Relevance of Sales Documents that needs to be maintained, and this is where you will in effect indicate the parameters that will apply to let the system know that a particular sales order should be planned in TM or not. Now, the input parameters that will be used to determine whether a sales order is planned via TM or not are those indicated there, being the sales area, so the sales org, the distribution channel and the division, the sales document type, and the shipping condition. So if we look at the second line, if our sales order has the sales area 1710.10.00 is a document type of type OR and the shipping condition is 05, then this sales order will be fulfilling the parameters that make it a candidate for being planned in TM. Now, the output of those 5 input parameters are the control key and the logistics integration profile. The control key 0052, which is not something that you can customize, is essentially that indicator, that signal to the system to say, yes, this sales order is to be planned in TM. So if you want that combination to be planned in TM, you need to indicate the control key 0052. The next piece of information that you need to indicate is the logistics integration profile, and in this case we have S002. Now, the one key piece of information I would say that is contained in that logistics integration profile is the freight unit building rule, and the freight unit building rule in this case is FUBR 2. And as we said previously, the freight unit building rule is of primary importance because it is that glue between sales and transportation. And the purpose, the intent of that freight unit building rule is to answer the question, is this going to yield a realistic transportable load? What do we mean by that? Well, a sales order is going to have multiple items as we have in this case. And the freight unit building rule by default is going to try and consolidate as much freight, as many of the sales order items together, as long as it makes logical sense. For example, if you have diverging delivery dates or diverging delivery locations, it doesn't make sense to group those items together. So when we talk about consolidating freight, it's going to consolidate freight in a logical, meaningful manner, i.e. items that are requested for the same date and that need to be shipped to the same place. However, even in those cases where I am going to consolidate freight together that makes sense, it is possible that it's going to yield a freight unit, a transportable load that just doesn't make sense, because let's say I produce a freight unit that is an aggregate weight of 500 tons. There is no transportation resource such as a truck out there that can carry a load of 500 tons. So there's no point in me trying to produce a freight unit of 500 tons if there is no way for me to plan it when I get to the transportation cockpit. So again, that's also part of the control and objective of the freight unit building rule, to produce a transportable load that will be making sense, that is realistic with regard to those transportation resources that you have. To illustrate how the freight unit building rule works, we'll use the example that we have before us. So again, we have our sales order on the left, which is made up of 6 items, and we've highlighted in red those 4 sales order items that it would make sense to group together because they share a common requested delivery date and requested delivery location. On the right, we have the available resources, which are the transportation resources that my carriers provide us at our disposal. And they provide us either 20-foot containers or 40-foot containers. The 20-foot container has a capacity of 33 cubic meters, and the 40-foot container has a capacity of 67 cubic meters. Going back to our sales order, we've identified that those 4 items have a consolidated volume of 70 cubic meters. And the freight unit building rule will by default try to consolidate as much as possible, meaning that it will try to group together as many sales order items as possible together, yielding as little as possible in terms of freight units. If we look at the example that we have before us, we've determined, or the system has determined, that those 4 items have a consolidated volume of 70 cubic meters and hence yielded or produced 1 freight unit of 70 cubic meters. However, when I then go on to planning, I find myself in a bit of a pickle because I have this 1 freight unit of 70 cubic meters, but the biggest transportation resource that I have at my disposal is that 40-foot container, which is 67 cubic meters, meaning that it's impossible for me to put my freight unit into those transportation resources that are at my disposal. Or unless I would have to have a little bit of my cargo sticking off the back of my container, which is not acceptable, nor possible, nor realistic. So what this is trying to illustrate is that whilst the intent of consolidating as much freight as possible is a worthy intent, it's not always going to yield a workable scenario. So if we move on to this particular slide, we are now going to introduce a new parameter which exists in the freight unit building rule, and that is the notion of split quantity. So to address the scenario that we had before, where sometimes I need to limit how much cargo is going to be consolidated into 1 freight unit due to the limitation that is presented by the transportation units that are at my disposal, we can actually put a split quantity in that freight unit building rule. And that will tell the freight unit building rule that, please, yes, go ahead, consolidate as much cargo as possible, but when you reach that split quantity, I want you to close off that freight unit and start consolidating onto another freight unit until again you reach those 67 cubic meters, and repeat and so on until the entire volume of that sales order has been allocated to a freight unit. So again, we have our example. We have our sales order, which has a total volume of 70 cubic meters. We've indicated in our freight unit building rule a split quantity of 67 cubic meters. And the result is that the freight unit building rule is going to produce 1 freight unit of 67 cubic meters, i.e. it's consolidated as much as possible up to that split quantity. It has then closed off that freight unit and started to consolidate the remainder onto a other freight unit. So I end up with 2 freight units, one of 67 and one of 3 cubic meters. From a transportation point of view, it then allows me to put that 67 cubic meter load into my 40-foot container, and I can put the remainder in a smaller 20-foot container, for example. Another variation on that scenario is that I could have opted to not indicate a split quantity of 67, but of 33 cubic meters. The process would have been the same in the sense that the system would have consolidated up to 33 cubic meters, closed off that freight unit, started a new one, and so on. The result here is that it consolidated the cargo up to 33 cubic meters, produced 1 freight unit, moved on to consolidating to another freight unit up to 33 cubic meters, closed that one off, then started and produced a third one for the remainder of 4 cubic meters. So the result here is that I have ended up with not 2 but 3 freight units, allowing me this time to leverage 20-foot containers only. I could also, in the transportation cockpit, have decided to put those two 33 cubic meter freight units into one 40-foot container. That is, of course, a decision that you make when you are dispatching, when you're planning those freight units to freight your orders. Lastly, I'm also now going to introduce for that same sales order a third transportation resource, which is a rigid that has a capacity of, say, 10 cubic meters. So in addition to my two containers, 20 and 40-foot container, I now also have my carrier saying, well, we can also provide you a rigid that has a capacity of 10 cubic meters. However, because a freight unit once created cannot be split in basic transportation management, it means that when you are going to set up your freight unit building rule, you need to plan for the common denominator. In other words, as I said previously, if you were going to produce, let's say, freight units of 33 cubic meters, it would be impossible for you to load them onto those rigids that have a maximum capacity of 10 cubic meters. So to be able to leverage all of those resources that are at my disposal, namely the 20-40-foot container as well as the 10 cubic meter rigid, it means that I would need to indicate a split quantity of 10 cubic meters in my freight unit building rule. And whereas in the previous example, depending on the split quantity, I ended up with 2 or 3 freight units, we can see that in this scenario, I would essentially split those 70 cubic meters into 7 10 cubic meter freight units. So the upside here is that all of a sudden I have a lot more flexibility in terms of being able to leverage all the transportation resources that I have. I can combine, like for example here I could put 4 freight units into that 40-foot container. I could put, for example, 3 10 cubic meter freight units into my 20-foot container. I could also use 7 rigids, each having a freight unit of 10 cubic meters. So it gives me flexibility, but the downside as well is that now when I get to the transportation planning cockpit, I don't have just 1 or 2 or 3 freight units to contend with, but I've got 7, which means that possibly, depending on the amount of sales orders and produced freight units, your workflow, your load, the time that you will spend in the transportation cockpit will be greater. So that is really something that you need to consider and look into and test when you are going to be setting up your freight unit building rules. The best way to explain this is probably with a real example. So let's just jump into the system, and before we get going, and so that we can track the progress of what we're changing, let's go and look at the freight unit building rules first. So there's this app called Manage Freight Unit Building Rules. And as I said previously, the standard freight unit building rule associated with the logistics integration profile S002 is FUBR2. So this is the one that we are using to generate internal freight units. So when we say internal, meaning transportation planning done in S/4HANA Cloud. So let's have a quick look at this freight unit building rule, and we can see that there is nothing extraordinary about it. It just says that the critical quantity is gross weight. The document type is SFU2, hence this pertains to the freight unit type that will be produced. It will be stored in a document type SFU2. And we can also see that the planning quantities used for freight units are either gross weight or gross volume, so kilos or cubic meters, and we've got no information here regarding split quantities or rounding quantities. So let's just get out of that. Now I have also prepared a sales order, which is this order 862, and at this point, so that we can again track the progress of changing the freight unit building rule that it has on the freight unit, we can see that this sales order is completely empty. There's nothing in there. So at this point, if we also look at the freight units, and if we look at the freight units that exist for this sales order 862, we can see that there is nothing. So that's absolutely normal. So let's start off by changing this sales order. And what we'll do is we'll put one item in there, which is going to be PRTG11. We'll put in a quantity of 1. And we are going to keep the requested delivery date of the 3rd of the 9th. And I'm just going to save this sales order item. So the order is saved. And what I'm expecting to happen at this point is that we will have one freight unit having been created for that sales order item, because remember, we are still in that logic of consolidating as much as possible. So I'll go to my manage freight units. I'm going to say go, and we should hopefully have one freight unit created. There we go. We have one freight unit that has been produced. I'm going to go back to my sales order, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a new item. Let me go back into change mode. Now I'm going to add the exact same item, PRTG11, quantity of 1, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to indicate a different requested delivery date, because remember, as I said earlier on, we have this hard constraint concept that is baked into the product that will try to consolidate as much of the freight as possible, provided the delivery dates and locations match. Now in this case we have diverging requested delivery dates. The ship to address is still the same, but the dates are different. So once I save this order, my expectation will be that we then have 2 freight units being created. So let me save this. The order has been saved, and if we update the freight units for document 862, we can see that we now have 2 freight units. So this hard constraint concept kicked in, determined that the delivery dates were different, and hence wasn't going to consolidate those 2 sales order items onto the same freight units. Now what I'm going to quickly do as well here to make a bit more sense when we track all this information, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for example, add the quantity. I'm going to bring it right up there, and also the weight, because that's the critical quantity in the freight unit that we have at the moment. So let me also just put the freight unit right up front again. Say OK. Right, so this matches the 2 sales order items that we have. The quantity is 18 kilos for each one of those sales order items. So let's go back to my sales order. And what we'll do is again change that sales order. And what we will do is we are going to add another item, PRTG11, for 1 unit, but we are going to keep the same date as that first item, which is the 3rd of the 9th. I'm going to save this, but again, applying this idea of hard constraints and consolidating as much as possible, the system should consolidate this item 30 with item 10, because the date as well as the ship to location are strictly identical. So let me save this. All good. And again, if we go back and check the freight units, I should still have my 2 freight units, but as we can see, we have 1 freight unit that has been amended with now a gross weight of 36 kilos. Hence, those 2 sales order items, 10 and 30, have been clubbed together into that 1 freight unit. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to go back to the freight unit building rule. So again, SFUBR2. And what we are going to do now is to illustrate the splitting capability in the freight unit building rule, we're going to introduce a split quantity of 20 kilos. Now, what we will try to show here are two things. Number one, we know that each item that we have in the sales order weighs 18 kilos. And what we've indicated there is we've said, well, we want the system to build freight units, but as soon as a weight of 20 kilos is reached, I want you to go ahead and create a new freight unit. But we must also understand that each one of those items cannot be divided. In other words, I can't take one item and then take another item, split it in multiple quantities so that I can group an additional 2 kilos in the first freight unit. No, the system understands that one piece cannot be divided in this case. So I'm going to save that split quantity of 20 kilos. So it's there. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go back to my sales order. And for the first item that we had, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the customer came back and he said that he now wanted 2. But remembering what happened previously. Previously what happened was the system clubbed together this one piece with this one piece that we had. And now we've amended the quantity of the first item from 1 to 2. So we've got 3 items. Each item is 18 kilos. We've said that we want the split quantity to be of 20 kilos. So if everything works well, we should, once we save the sales order, end up with 4 freight units. i.e., we would expect to have 2 freight units for these 2 items, 1 freight unit for this one item, and then of course we have the odd one out, which is for a different delivery date anyway, that would also have a dedicated freight unit. So I would expect to see 4 freight units after this sales order is saved. So let's go ahead and save it. Perfect. We go back to our freight units. We click again, go. And as I said, we can now see that we have 4 freight units for our sales order 862. And again, where previously we had this freight unit that had been amended to 36 kilos, now has gone back down to 18 kilos because it contains only 1 unit of that product that we are selling to the customer. So what this essentially means is that in transportation planning, which will be in the next episode, we'll see that the transportation planner or the loader now has to dispatch not 2 freight units but 4 freight units. And this obviously presents many advantages, much more flexibility with regards to how the items are going to be planned. But the takeaway of this episode is that the freight unit building rule is a key component of this whole end-to-end TM process. You need to get those freight unit building rules spot on to avoid too much rework or errors once you get to the actual transportation planning part. Lastly, make sure you visit the SAP help for more information on the capabilities of TM in SAP S/4HANA Cloud, but also as it pertains to today's episode with respect to the freight unit building rule and the logistics integration profile. And the SSE UI that was referenced earlier in the presentation, you can find it by going to Application Area Supply Chain, Sub-Application Area Transportation Management, and then selecting the Transportation Order Management section to give you access to define transportation relevance of sales documents. And there you can maintain for the combination of sales area, document type, and shipping condition, which sales documents should be planned via transportation management. So this is the end of today's episode. I hope that it has been informative and that you now have a better grasp of what settings you need to apply in the system to make sure that a particular sales document is going to be planned via transportation management. And secondly, it has also given you insights into what the purpose and use of the freight unit building rule is, and also provide you some information that is going to be used as input into your own thought process with regards to what settings you will make to the freight unit building rule to as closely as possible align to your own business requirements. Until next time, when we look at the planning part, stay safe.
My dad's make it hurt.